The stars had always been quiet. For 10,000 years, the collective moved through the galaxy like a slow tide, swallowing everything in its path. They were patient. They were methodical. They were unstoppable. 17 civilizations had fallen before them. Some had been ancient and wise, with libraries that held the knowledge of 1,000,000 years. Some had been young and fierce, with warriors who knew no fear. Some had been peaceful, hoping that kindness might spare them. It did not matter. All of them fell. All of them became dust in memory, their world stripped of resources, their people scattered or destroyed. They did not see themselves as evil. They saw themselves as inevitable. The universe was a harsh place, and only the strong survived. They had proven their strength across 3 galactic arms, and no force had ever truly challenged them. Their fleets were vast beyond counting. Their weapons could crack planets like eggs. Their soldiers were bred for war and knew nothing else. When their scout ships found the small blue world orbiting an unremarkable yellow star, they felt nothing special. Just another primitive species on the long list of primitive species. The scouts watched from the edge of the solar system for 6 months, gathering data, learning everything they could about the creatures who called themselves human. What they found was not impressive. Humans had only recently discovered how to split the atom. They had walked on their moon a few times and then stopped, as if they had lost interest. They spent most of their energy fighting each other over invisible lines drawn on maps, over ideas about gods and governments, over resources they could have shared but chose not to. Their world was divided into hundreds of competing groups that could not agree on anything. The analysts ran their models. The probability of successful resistance was 0.003%. This was actually higher than most species they encountered, but still so small that it might as well have been zero. The humans were quarrelsome and divided. They would fall like all the others. The collective assembled a fleet of 3,000 warships. This was considered excessive for such a primitive target, but they believed in overwhelming force. It was cleaner that way, faster, more merciful in its own cold fashion. They arrived on a Tuesday, emerging from faster-than-light travel in a formation that blocked out the sun for anyone standing on the daylight side of Earth. The shadow fell across North America and Europe, and for a moment, the entire world went silent. Every television, every radio, every phone suddenly showed the same image. Ships beyond counting, hanging in the sky like a death sentence written in metal and fire. The message came in every human language simultaneously. They had learned them all during their observation period. The words were simple and left no room for misunderstanding. You have 72 hours to surrender unconditionally. All governments will dissolve. All military forces will disarm. All resources will be transferred to collective control. Resistance will result in the complete destruction of your species. This is not a negotiation. This is your only warning. Then silence. The ships hung there waiting, patient as stones. The first 12 hours were chaos. Some governments wanted to surrender immediately. Others wanted to fight. Religious leaders called for prayer. Scientists called for calm. Ordinary people did what ordinary people always do in moments of crisis. They held their families close and wondered if they would live to see another sunrise. But something strange began to happen in those first 12 hours. Something they had not predicted because they had never seen it before. Enemies began to talk to each other. In a secure bunker beneath Moscow, Russian generals opened a direct line to their American counterparts. The old hatreds were still there, the decades of suspicion and fear, but they seemed suddenly small compared to the shadow in the sky. In Beijing, Chinese officials shared classified research with Japanese scientists. In the Middle East, soldiers who had been shooting at each other the day before put down their weapons and looked upward together. It was not unity, not yet. It was something than that. It was the recognition that they were all, every single one of them, facing extinction. The lines on the maps had never meant anything to the universe. Now everyone could see that clearly. The United Nations held an emergency session. For the first time in its history, every member nation agreed on something. They would not surrender. They could not surrender. To surrender was to accept the end of everything humanity had ever been or could ever become. This decision was not rational. The fleet could destroy every city on Earth in a matter of hours. Human weapons were laughably primitive by comparison. The smart choice, the logical choice, was to submit and hope for mercy. But humans had never been good at making the smart choice. In the hours that followed, the world transformed. Factories that had been making cars started making weapons. Research laboratories dropped their commercial projects and began studying the limited data available about technology. Military forces around the globe started sharing information that had been classified for decades. Old generals who had spent their careers planning how to fight each other now sat in the same rooms, studying the same enemy. Old rivals became allies. Old secrets became shared knowledge. And something else emerged, something that had not factored into their calculations at all. Anger. Not fear, though there was plenty of that. Not despair, though despair would have been reasonable. Anger. A deep, burning fury at being told they were nothing. At being told their entire history, their art and music and love and struggle meant nothing to the universe. At being told to kneel. Humans, it turned out, did not kneel easily. The 72 hours passed. The deadline came and went. No surrender was offered. The commander, a creature named who had overseen the subjugation of 4 worlds, studied the silence from his flagship with something close to confusion. His models had predicted a 94% chance of surrender. Humans were divided and weak. They should have broken. He opened a channel to the planet below. "Your deadline has passed. Do you wish to reconsider?" The response came from a human female, her voice carried by every broadcast system on Earth. She was the Secretary General of the United Nations, chosen by unanimous vote to speak for her species. "We have considered your offer carefully," she said. Her voice was calm, almost pleasant. "We have decided to decline. If you want our world, you will have to take it, and I promise you it will cost you more than you can imagine." Felt something he had not felt in centuries of conquest. It took him a moment to identify the emotion, because it was so unfamiliar. Doubt. He dismissed it and gave the order to begin the invasion. The first wave of landing craft descended toward Earth, carrying soldiers who had never known defeat. They were about to learn. The first forces landed in what humans called Eastern Europe. They chose the location because their models suggested it would be lightly defended. The major population centers were elsewhere, and human military doctrine emphasized protecting cities. The models were wrong. The landing craft touched down in fields and forests that seemed empty. Soldiers emerged in perfect formation, their armor gleaming, their weapons ready. They expected scattered resistance, perhaps some primitive projectile weapons, perhaps some desperate charges by brave but doomed defenders. Instead, they found nothing: empty fields, silent forests, no resistance at all. This should have been a warning. Watched from orbit as his forces advanced toward the nearest human settlement. His tactical displays showed no enemy forces in the area. The humans had apparently fled. Then the ground exploded. The humans had spent their 72 hours well. Every road was mined. Every bridge was rigged to collapse. Every building that might provide shelter had been transformed into a trap. The forests that seemed empty held thousands of soldiers who had learned to hide so well that sensors could not detect them. The first attack killed 300 soldiers in under a minute. The survivors regrouped and advanced, only to find more traps, more ambushes, more death waiting around every corner. This was not how war was supposed to work. They had conquered species that met them in open battle. They had conquered species that built great fortresses and dared them to attack. They had conquered species that fled and species that surrendered and species that fought to the last soldier. They had never conquered a species that refused to play by any rules at all. The first month of the war was a nightmare for the. Every projection, every model, every simulation proved worthless. Human forces appeared from nowhere, struck hard, and vanished before counterattacks could be organized. Cities that should have fallen in hours held for weeks. Soldiers who should have been terrified fought with a fury that explanation. Studied the reports with growing unease. His forces were winning technically. They controlled more territory each day, but the cost was staggering. For every human they killed, they lost soldiers of their own. For every city they captured, they spent resources they could not easily replace. The humans were not supposed to be able to hurt them. The humans were primitives with primitive weapons, but those primitive weapons were everywhere, and the humans used them with a creativity that bordered on madness. They turned farming equipment into bombs. They used their primitive flying machines for suicide attacks against command ships. They dug tunnels beneath occupied cities and collapsed entire districts on top of garrisons. They poisoned water supplies, sabotaged power systems, and made every moment of occupation a living hell. And they kept fighting. No matter how many losses they took, no matter how hopeless the situation seemed, they kept fighting. They had a word for species that refused to surrender even when defeat was certain. The word translated roughly as broken or insane. They had seen it before, in the final days of dying civilizations, when hope had fled and only madness remained. But this was different. The humans were not broken. They were not mad. They were something they had never encountered, a species that simply refused to accept that defeat was possible. In the second month, human scientists achieved something remarkable. Working in hidden laboratories, using fragments of technology captured in the early battles, they began to understand how the alien weapons worked. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to begin building countermeasures. Enough to begin adapting. The first human-built energy shield was ugly and primitive by standards. It could only stop a few shots before failing. But it could stop those few shots, and that changed everything. The first human-built plasma weapon was even uglier. It was heavy and awkward and overheated after 3 shots. But those 3 shots could punch through armor, and suddenly the invaders were not invincible anymore. Word spread through the human resistance like fire. The aliens could be hurt. The aliens could be killed. The aliens could be beaten. Received reports of human soldiers charging positions while shouting words in their many languages. His translators worked to understand the words, and when they did, they found the same meaning repeated over and over in 100 different tongues. They can bleed. They had never bled before, not like this, not in any war they had ever fought. By the third month, something had shifted in the nature of the conflict. The humans were no longer simply defending. They were attacking. Small raids at first, then larger operations. They struck supply lines, destroyed ammunition depots, and assassinated commanders. They learned the alien language and used it to spread false orders. They captured enemy communications equipment and filled the networks with confusion. They identified which soldiers were leaders and targeted them specifically, knowing that the collective's rigid hierarchy would struggle to adapt to sudden losses. Human commanders studied every battle, won or lost, and learned from each one. They shared what they learned freely, spreading knowledge across their entire species instead of hoarding it. They tried things that no sane strategist would attempt, and sometimes those things worked brilliantly. Found himself in a position no commander had occupied in 1,000 years. He was requesting reinforcements. The collective council received his request with something close to disbelief. 3,000 ships should have been more than enough to subjugate a primitive world. The fact that needed more suggested a failure that went beyond mere military setback. But they sent the reinforcements. Another 1,000 ships, another 500,000 soldiers. Surely this would be enough to end the matter. It was not enough. The humans had used the time to prepare. They had built more weapons, dug more tunnels, laid more traps. They had established hidden bases on their moon and on the asteroid belt, places they had dismissed as unimportant. They had learned to move through space, clumsily but effectively, and now they were not just defending their planet. They were taking the war to the enemy. The first human attack on a warship was a suicide mission. A small craft packed with explosives, flown by volunteers who knew they would not survive, crashed into the engine section of a destroyer. The explosion killed everyone on board, human and alike. But the destroyer was crippled, and the humans had proven something important. The invaders could be reached. The invaders could be hurt. The invaders were not gods. More attacks followed. Some succeeded, some failed, but each one taught the humans something new. They learned where the ships were weakest. They learned how they responded to different threats. They learned and they adapted and they kept fighting. 1 year after the invasion began, they controlled less territory than they had after the first week. Stood on the bridge of his flagship and stared at tactical displays that made no sense. His forces were superior in every measurable way. They had better weapons, better ships, better training, better everything. And yet they were losing. Slowly, painfully, undeniably losing. He had studied human history during the long months of the war, trying to understand his enemy. What he found disturbed him deeply. This species had been fighting impossible odds since before they discovered fire. They had survived ice ages and plagues and famines. They had built civilizations in deserts and jungles and frozen wastelands. They had fought each other constantly, brutally, for their entire existence, and yet they had never destroyed themselves. They were chaos given form. They were unpredictability made flesh. They were everything the orderly, logical were not, and they were winning because of it. The humans had a saying that found particularly troubling. They said it in many languages, but the meaning was always the same. What doesn't kill me makes me stronger. They had not killed the humans, and now, with every passing day, the humans grew stronger. The war was not over. The humans had not won. But for the first time in the long history of the collective, victory was no longer certain. And in command centers and resistance bases across Earth, humans who had been told they could not win looked at each other and smiled. They had been told it was impossible. They had never believed it for a moment. 3 years had passed since the shadow first fell across the Earth. 3 years of war, of sacrifice, of horrors that would haunt humanity for generations. But also 3 years of transformation, of growth, of becoming something new. The humans who greeted the diplomatic vessel were not the same species the collective had tried to conquer. They had changed in ways that went beyond mere technology, though the technology had changed dramatically as well. In hidden facilities across the solar system, human scientists had done more than reverse engineer weapons. They had improved them. They had combined alien technology with human ingenuity and created something neither species had imagined possible. Human ships now traveled faster than light, crude and dangerous but functional. Human weapons now matched firepower. Human soldiers wore armor that could withstand plasma fire. But the greater change was something less tangible. Humanity had remembered what it meant to be one species. The old divisions had not disappeared entirely. Humans were still humans, still capable of pettiness and cruelty and short-sighted foolishness. But they had also proven capable of rising above those weaknesses when survival demanded it. The unity forged in the fires of war had become something permanent, something that would endure even after the last ship departed. The diplomatic vessel descended through Earth's atmosphere and landed on the plains of what had once been Central Asia. This region had seen some of the worst fighting of the war, and the landscape bore witness to the cost of resistance. Craters pocked the earth where cities had stood. Vast stretches of land were still poisoned by weapons that had been deployed in desperation by both sides. A human delegation waited on the scorched ground. They had chosen this location deliberately. They wanted to see what they had done. They wanted to understand the price of their arrogance. Emerged from the diplomatic vessel flanked by guards who tried to hide their nervousness. He had aged in the 3 years since the invasion began. His species did not show age the way humans did, but something in his bearing had changed. The certainty was gone. The absolute confidence that had defined the collective for 10,000 years had crumbled in the face of human stubbornness. The human delegation was led by Secretary General, the same woman who had delivered humanity's refusal to surrender 3 years earlier. She had been young then, barely 40, chosen for her ability to project calm in crisis. Now there were streaks in her hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and impossible decisions. She had ordered attacks that killed thousands. She had authorized weapons that poisoned the land for centuries. She had done things that would have horrified her younger self, all in the name of survival. And she had no regrets because her species still existed to have this conversation. "Commander," she said, her voice carrying across the devastated plain, "we were not expecting a diplomatic vessel." "No," he admitted. "You were expecting more warships. You were expecting another assault, another attempt to break your defenses. We were prepared for that." "I know." He paused, studying the human woman with eyes that had seen civilizations rise and fall. "That is why I am here instead." The negotiations took place in a temporary structure built on neutral ground. Neutral was a human concept that they had never needed before. They had never negotiated with equals. They were learning now. The collective's position was weaker than anyone would have believed 3 years earlier. The war with Earth had drained resources that were meant for other conquests. The reinforcements sent to support had left gaps in defenses elsewhere. And worst of all, word had spread. 3 of the 17 species the collective had previously conquered had watched the human resistance with growing hope. A peaceful people who had surrendered without fighting began to organize in secret. The warriors who had been broken by overwhelming force started to remember their pride. The ancient and wise began to plan for a future they had given up on long ago. None of them had yet risen up openly. They were waiting, watching, seeing how the war with humanity would end. If humans could resist, if humans could survive, then perhaps resistance was possible after all. Perhaps the collective was not invincible. Perhaps freedom was more than a dream. Understood all of this. He understood that the war with Earth had become about more than Earth. If the collective destroyed humanity completely, they would prove their strength and crush the growing hope among their subject peoples. But they had tried to destroy humanity for 3 years and failed. Every day the war continued was another day for that hope to grow. "What are your terms?" asked when the formal proceedings began. Had prepared for this question. Immediate cessation of hostilities, withdrawal of all collective forces from your solar system, recognition of human sovereignty over your current territory. The human delegation exchanged glances. These terms were more generous than they had dared to hope. 3 years ago, they had demanded unconditional surrender. Now they were offering something close to unconditional withdrawal. And in exchange, pressed. "You will not pursue us. You will not seek revenge. You will not." He hesitated, searching for words that did not come easily. "You will not spread your influence to other species under collective control." Smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile. "You're afraid." Did not deny it. "Your species has proven unpredictable. The models that have served us for 10,000 years do not account for you. Every projection we made about this war proved wrong. Every assumption we held was challenged and broken. And now you want us to stay in our corner of the galaxy like good little primitives. I want to end this war before it destroys both of us." The human delegation retired to consider the offer. The debate was fierce. Some wanted to accept immediately, to end the suffering and begin the long work of rebuilding. Others wanted to push for more, to demand reparations for the millions who had died. A few wanted to reject the offer entirely, to continue fighting until the collective was broken beyond recovery. Listened to all of them. Then she made a decision that would shape the future of the galaxy. She returned to the negotiating table and looked directly in his alien eyes. "We accept your terms," she said, "with one modification." Tensed, "What modification?" "You asked us not to spread our influence to other species under collective control. We cannot agree to that." "Then there can be no treaty." "Let me finish," leaned forward. "We will not actively incite rebellion among your subjects. We will not provide weapons or military support to resistance movements, but we will not hide what we are. We will not pretend that we surrendered. If other species want to know how we survived, we will tell them. If they want to learn what we learned, we will teach them. If they want to fight for their freedom, we will not stop them." Was silent for a long moment. "You are asking us to accept the eventual collapse of everything we have built." "No," said. "We are telling you that the collapse is coming whether you accept it or not. The only question is whether it comes through war or through choice. You built your empire on the belief that resistance was futile. We proved that it isn't. That knowledge is already out there. It cannot be contained." The treaty was signed 3 days later. The collective its forces from the Sol system. The blockade was lifted. The war was over. But had been right. The knowledge could not be contained. Within a year they began their uprising. It was small at first, scattered acts of defiance that the collective easily crushed. But the defiance did not stop. It grew. It spread. Within 5 years they had driven collective forces from there. The battle was bloody and terrible, but they were willing to pay any price for freedom. They had watched humanity pay that price and survive. They could do no less. Within a decade, the collective was fighting on 7 fronts simultaneously. Their resources were stretched thin. Their fleets were scattered. Their certainty was gone. And throughout the galaxy, a word spread from species to species. A word that had no translation in most alien languages, because the concept it represented had been lost or forgotten or never known. Rebellion. Humanity did not conquer the galaxy. They had no desire for empire. The scars of their own history, the centuries of colonialism and exploitation, had taught them the price of domination. Instead, they did something far more dangerous. They taught. Human diplomats traveled to worlds that had never known freedom. They shared their history, their struggles, their failures as well as their successes. They showed that resistance was possible, that tyranny could be defeated, that hope was not foolish but necessary. Human scientists shared their technology freely, helping species that had been deliberately kept primitive to advance rapidly. Human soldiers trained fighters who had forgotten how to fight, teaching them tactics that the collective had never faced. And human philosophers shared the most dangerous weapon of all, the idea that every thinking being had the right to determine their own destiny. The collective did not fall in a single dramatic collapse. It crumbled slowly, over decades, as species after species reclaimed their independence. Some did it peacefully, negotiating from positions of strength that the collective could no longer challenge. Some did it violently, burning away the last remnants of occupation with fire and blood. By the time a century had passed since the day the shadow first fell across Earth, the collective existed only as a memory. The species that had once ruled 3 galactic arms now controlled only their home system, surrounded by former subjects who remembered all too well what tyranny felt like. They were not destroyed. Humanity argued against genocide despite the suffering that had caused. Revenge, humans had learned, was a poison that destroyed the avenger as surely as the enemy. Instead, they were contained, watched, given the opportunity to become something better than they had been. Some of them did. Others clung to bitterness and dreams of restoration that would never come true. That, too, was familiar to humans, who had seen the same pattern in their own history. Did not live to see the final dissolution of the collective. She died 60 years after the war ended, peacefully, surrounded by family, satisfied that she had done what needed to be done. Her final words, recorded for posterity, became famous across 100 worlds. "They told us it was impossible," she said. "They told us we were too primitive, too divided, too weak. They were wrong. We were not weak. We were stubborn, we were angry, we were human, and that was enough." The monument built in her honor stood on the scorched plain where the treaty had been signed, where the war had ended and the future had begun. It was simple, as she had requested, a single pillar of stone bearing words in every human language and dozens of alien ones. The words were the same in every translation. "They fought the impossible lost." And across the galaxy, on worlds that had once known only subjugation, beings of 1,000 different species read those words and understood them. They understood that the universe was not a place where the strong always prevailed and the weak always perished. They understood that courage mattered, that hope mattered, that the will to fight for something greater than survival could change everything. They understood that humanity had given them a gift more precious than technology or weapons or alliances. Humanity had given them the knowledge that impossible was just another word for not yet done.